Standing here in the barren and beautiful Cambrian Mountains in West Wales, which lie between the distinctive slopes of the Brecon Beacons to the south and the more rugged mountains of Snowdonia to the north, it's impossible not to be impressed by the sheer splendour of this great landscape.
It is from here where we will explore the length of the River Teifi, following its influences on the landscape, the people and the wildlife. These mountains are 400 million years old, some of the oldest mountains in the world, 340 million years older than the Rockies, the Andes or the Himalayas. And this means the forces of erosion, the rain, the wind and the ice sheets have had millions of years longer to wear down the landscape, creating a vast undulating plateau. The Cambrian Mountains may be vast and barren, but they hold a significant secret. The vegetation soaks up water like a sponge, and when it becomes saturated, it releases trickles of water, forming the source of the River Teifi. These trickles soon change, creating small mountain streams, and as other tributaries join, the flow quickens, cascading down the mountain, forming wider channels and exposing the rocks below. This wild, water-sodden landscape has been home to people over the millennia, eking out a living from subsistence farming on the gentle slopes or mining the rich mineral seams in the valley sides. As the river leaves the mountains and meanders through the flat glacial valleys heading west, more established settled farming developed. Regular winter flooding provided nutrient-rich deposits on the fields where both cattle and crops flourished. At this stage, the River Teifi may still be at the start of its journey, but it already has an abundance of life. Rich in oxygen and nutrients from the sediments carried with the flow, numerous animals thrive amongst the rocks and vegetation. Caddisfly larvae scavenge old twigs and branches to create a unique camouflage home they carry with them. Freshwater shrimps find the best nutrients on the riverbanks to feed themselves. And pond skaters make the most of the spring sunshine to attract a mate in the shallow pools. However, there is a common bird which uses the river as a source of their daily meal. A robin. Hopping up and down on the rocky outcrops, it chooses what is on the menu. Making the most of the low water levels, the robin picks off hundreds of flies in a day, and with one final drink, he returns home and will make the same journey again tomorrow. Like many of Britain's rivers, the Teifi supports a complex web of wildlife. It was around the year 1200, on the flower-rich meadows beside the River Teifi, that the Abbey of Strata Florida was founded, which translates from Latin as the Vale of Flowers. It was established by Cistercian monks as a place of worship and contemplation due to its isolation and solitude. This was part of a much larger movement that spread across the whole of Western Europe in the early Middle Ages. It became the most famous and important church seat in Wales after St David's, developing as a place of pilgrimage and power and becoming a linchpin of Welsh culture. However, like many others, it was all but destroyed after the violence brought by Henry VIII, and now all that's left is its ruin. As the Teifi turns south, it enters one of the most important wildlife habitats along its course, Cors Caron. Now a nature reserve and covering nearly 2,000 acres, it is one of the best examples of a raised bog in Britain. About 7,000 years ago, the climate became wetter and sphagnum bog mosses grew in abundance. As they died, they partially decomposed, forming a dark brown peat on which more bog mosses grew. Over the years, the peat surface built up into a gentle dome, reaching a height of 7 metres. Bog mosses still grow in profusion here. Life on this little hump is tough. Plants like white flowering cotton grass and purple leafed heath rely on rainwater. If the peat didn't act like a giant sponge, they couldn't survive. Historically, peat was cut and dried by the local population to use and sell as fuel for fires. These peat cuttings once scarred the landscape, but today they are an important, diverse wetland habitat. This small peat cutting provides a perfect place for dragonflies and damselflies to reproduce. Having spent 2 years as aquatic larvae, they only live a few weeks as winged adults. Reproduction is now the top priority. The male guards the female from rivals while she lays her eggs. The female carefully lays these onto emergent vegetation in the slow-flowing waterways. Frog spawn is also visible from the surface, but when you venture below, it is a whole new world. Daphnia water fleas are numerous, providing the food source for a much larger aquatic carnivore, the newt. By mid-spring, tadpoles are abundant. Hundreds of them cloud the water, all competing for food, but many will not survive. As the weeks go by, they begin to grow their back legs, and their faces become more rigid, like their parents. In 1860, Cawes Carron Bog created the Manchester and Milford Railway Company a significant problem. Having received the royal assent to extend the railway from Carmarthen to Aberystwyth, they had to overcome the issue of how to construct a railway over a landscape with no solid ground, just peat and moss 7 metres deep. The final technique used in the construction was the use of wooden fascines filled with bales of sheep's wool from the surrounding farms, effectively creating a form of floating embankment, and the railway was finally opened 4 years later. As the river leaves the bog, it starts to meander through the floodplain, forming ripples and shallow pools. It is here that an aggressive species lurks amongst the rocks. Introduced in the 1960s from North America to Finland and then to Sweden, it has made its way to West Wales. Signal Crayfish. Now the most common in the UK and spreading along many rivers, they're able to travel distances of over 150 metres in the water and several hundred metres over land. Their size and aggressive nature threatens many species. Their burrows displace water voles, and the native crayfish is being driven towards near extinction through the spread of crayfish plague and competition for food. Sheep have grazed the valley sides and expansive floodplains along the River Teifi for thousands of years. The valley has long been a rich agricultural area with both crops, dairy produce and wool being produced in abundance. Rivers have always been a valuable source of power, and the bountiful Teifi was no exception. Water power was used in corn mills, sawmills, woolen factories and tanneries. The Teifi Valley had the largest concentration of woolen mills in West Wales, producing fine flannel for shirting, blankets with distinctive patterns, tweeds and yarns. Warm, moist air sweeps across the Atlantic Ocean and up the valley. Slowly, it begins to condense into great clouds. Gathering together, the clouds grow and become saturated and then burst. Water levels rise rapidly, and over the course of 24 hours, hundreds of gallons of water cascade down the river every second. Tinted brown with tons of eroded sediment, the river is at its most powerful, reshaping its profile and course as it thunders towards the sea. With the huge increase in water, it eventually overtops its banks, creating a great flood. Nutrient-rich sediment is deposited, providing valuable fertilizer for the following year's growth. The river forms a natural defence for Kilgerran Castle. Standing tall over the deep gorge, the river here is just at its tidal limits, so the castle was able to control both a natural crossing point and the passage of ships going to the sea. The castle is steeped in hundreds of years of warring conflict. One of the most significant battles was during the Civil War. The parliamentarians stormed the castle sheltering royalists who were garrisoned inside, destroying much of the northern wall. Now all that is left are the prominent thick walls to the south and the remaining two towers. To the south of the river, just to the east of the town of Cardigan, are the Teifi marshes, managed by the Pembrokeshire Wildlife Trust. These comprise of hundreds of acres of unique and diverse wetland habitats, supporting a wide range of invertebrates, birds and even otters. To maintain this unique wetland ecosystem, periodic grazing is required to keep down invasive species. Being too wet for cattle, the Trust have recruited an ideal mammal: the water buffalo. Able to tolerate the marshy conditions, they form wallow holes or pools, creating diverse aquatic habitats amongst the more dense reeds and rush vegetation. As the river nears the end of its journey to the west of Cardigan, its characteristics change. Now a wide tidal estuary with gentle sloping mudflats, supporting a wide range of wading birds and sandbanks protruding above the surface. The very nature of the water also changes, becoming increasingly saline as it heads towards the sea, and as a result supports yet another unique habitat. The importance of the River Teifi on the communities and wildlife that live adjacent to its course is undeniable. However, increasing intensification of agriculture over the last decades have had a devastating impact on the river. In December 2018, agrochemicals entered the river from a tributary, resulting in the poisoning of miles of river and the death of thousands of fish. Only a few months later, in 2019, hundreds of fish and millions of invertebrates were killed when 120,000 gallons of slurry spilled into the river, causing devastation to its ecosystem.
It is increased events like these which make it extremely difficult for rivers to recover and maintain their rich and diverse habitats.
So, the future of the Teifi, like so many of Britain's rivers, is at risk.